I'm John Bishop with 1620 The Zone, celebrating 25 years. And today, my special guest is Kevin Kugler, who was a member of the team from 1899 to 1914. And he joins us on this special edition of the 25th anniversary show. In all seriousness, I thought we would focus on a very specific and I think probably the most important time, not only in the show's history, unsportsmanlike conduct, but in the station's history, because I think it's where everything changed, not only for the Zone, for the show, but for sports talk in Nebraska. First, let's go back. Give me an idea of what things were like in the early days of the show, starting in 2000, going up to 2003, just how different the world of sports talk was at that point.
Well, and it was very different. You know, we were still trying to figure out exactly how we were going to do it. And I was fortunate. I was paired to start the show with Bob Bruce, and I didn't know Bob at all. I'd never met him until we started doing the show together. But the founder, essentially, of all that we know as the Zone, Neil Nelkin, thought we would be a good pairing. I was doing Maverick football and basketball. That was when UNO had a football team, and UNO football and basketball was on the Zone, and I was working with Neil Nelkin on that. And he thought we'd be able to do a talk show, and he paired me with Bob Bruce. And I was fortunate because Bob came from a morning show background. I came from a play-by-play background, and I still didn't really know what I was at that point. And Bob wanted to do and thought we should do a show that was not some just stats callers show. He wanted to do it more like a morning show, where you'd do bits and you'd have fun and you'd be goofy and, you know, you would, because his theory, and I subscribed to this, he taught me well. His theory was that, you know, you're driving to work in the morning and morning shows are being fun and having silly things go on. Why, when you're driving home, wouldn't you want that too? And so that was kind of the approach that we took to it. It was a lot less hot takey. It was a lot less contentious around here because, look, Nebraska was coming off of still very successful football at that time. Frank Solich's regime was going on strong. 2001, they were playing for a title in the Rose Bowl. We went out to the Rose Bowl and covered it. I mean, it was a different time for sports talk, but then everything turned when Nebraska football turned in 2002. And everybody started to get a little angry. It got a little more contentious. Bob and I still joke about the fact that at one point, some callers suggested that we were swinging on the testicles of Jamal Lord at one point because we were being positive about the play of Jamal Lord in a certain game. It was a different time, but it did all turn right around 2002, 2003. When Nebraska football started to sink, that's really when sports talk had to evolve.
Was there a point inside of 2002, you know, the 7-7 season, where at least internally in your mind, you're thinking, I may have to pivot here. I can't necessarily defend everything I'm seeing on the field.
Yeah. And it happened during that time because by that point I'd had 2 years of doing sports talk under my belt. So I was at least a little more comfortable. I wasn't very comfortable with opinions when I first started. You know, from a play-by-play standpoint, my job was to describe what was happening on the field or on the court, and that was what I took seriously. And so I really struggled for a while being opinionated. It was difficult for me to do because I was very sensitive in the early days to the backlash that you'd get because, you know, that was the early days of message boards and all of this social commentary where people could find you easier. And I was a young parent. I was a, relatively young married guy at that point, although it'd been several years. But still, it was, you're just trying to figure out who you are. And that was different for me. And I had to really learn how to become opinionated. And that was what taught me that, was because you couldn't go out there and say, hey, guys, everything's fine. I mean, this looks great. It's all outstanding. The way I tried to temper it was I tempered it. I was on the Frank Solich bandwagon, if you will. And I thought Frank deserved a chance to reset with a new staff. And my opinion was, you saddled him with some guys who were clearly not interested in doing the job at the same level they had been, or not capable of doing the same job that they had been. And you should have given this man a chance to retool post that staff that carried over from the Osborne regime. And even that was controversial at the time, which in hindsight seems silly, but at the time, you have to remember these were legendary coaches that were on this staff, and to have anyone say, gosh, maybe they can't do what they need to do was somewhat oh boy, you don't do that. And so that was a little bit of a challenge to navigate that time while trying to figure out how to be an opinionated sports talker while also trying to grow a play-by-play career, which it's hard to marry the two.
Yeah.
But that was really where sports talk had to change, because you couldn't just go on the air. We would have been immediately dismissed. We were not the mouthpiece of the university. We couldn't be that show, because you have no credibility at all as the underdog in that situation, coming out and parroting the same line that the university is parroting.
Do you remember the first time you saw your name on a message board and people letting you have it for a take you had?
It was sometime in the 2002 season, and I remember seeing it and thinking, man, this is different. And it bothered me. I won't lie. That bothered me a little bit at that. Now, obviously, decades later, I could give a rip. But I was disturbed. I'm like, I'm a Nebraskan. I live here. This is my home. How could you people do this? It was a lot of hand-wringing in my mind of, oh my gosh, I've ruined everything. What am I going to do? And then you quickly learn that none of it matters, and it all goes away the very next day. But it helps callous you. You have to have a relatively thick skin to do this business anyway right now. Nobody's going to feel sorry for you if somebody, rubs you the wrong way with a comment, which is fine. It was a very difficult pill to swallow, thinking, wait a minute, I'm a native Nebraska guy. How could I possibly offend any of you?
Yeah. Speaking of that, of course, another native Nebraskan comes home, takes over the AD's job. I remember at the time how a lot of people felt. Steve Peterson's back here. Everything's going to be fine. He's an Osborne guy. I don't know how you felt, Kevin. But going into that season, I thought, okay, here's our chance to kind of heal everything that had happened. Because 2002, 7-7, just felt like, oh my God, the world's coming to an end. Where were you going into 2003?
I thought it was a chance for Nebraska to really set themselves back on track. Anybody who tells you that they didn't think Steve Peterson was the right hire in 2003 is lying to you. It was universally praised. It was a lot like the Scott Frost hire years later, where almost everybody thought that was 100% the right choice. Nobody thought there was another option. This was the guy who knew how to get it done. Everybody knew it. And then you knew as the season went along, you could kind of sense, there were a lot of leaks in the ship at that point. People saying, telling you things behind the scenes. You didn't have to look very far or look very hard to find somebody within the program who was going to tell you some of the stuff that was going on. It was very obvious at that time. In hindsight, I don't know if there's any way Frank Solich could have saved his job short of winning a national championship, because you had two different goals. Steve Peterson's goal was you got to be able to recruit big-time players for the future. Frank Solich's goal was to save the job and right the ship of the program in the short term. That was the only thing he was worried about, is how can we get this thing back on track quickly? And they did, to the tune of 10-3 that season. But of course, by the 10th win, he wasn't around to relish in that. That was the bowl win. But it was one of those situations where at the beginning, everybody knew this was going to be the right move. This was the right hire. And it quickly turned out to be not the case at all.
Do you remember a moment in 2003, whether it was hearing from people on the inside or the scuttlebutt or just what the lay of the land was, where it was like, oh, this thing might be coming apart here?
The Missouri loss was the first loss, and that one you could write off a little bit. They were on the road. It didn't really derail them a significant amount. I think they were a top 10 team, if I remember correctly, when they went down to Missouri, and they didn't fall out of the top 20. The Texas game was the first time you really started to hear people inside the program grumbling. There was, to their mind, a significant gap between the talent level at Texas and the talent level at Nebraska. And that was what Steve Peterson's entire plan was. We're not going to surrender the Big 12 to Oklahoma and Texas. Well, in that game, it looked like Nebraska had surrendered the talent edge to Texas in a significant way. The nail in the proverbial coffin was the K-State game. A, it was a blowout. B, it was at home. And that was the only one of those three bad losses that was at home for Nebraska. You just remember that day thinking, oh boy, this isn't good. The three best teams, I put best in quotes, they got destroyed by. Two of them were on the road. So you kind of, all right, well, it's hard to win on the road. But the K-State game was the one where you knew it was going to be really hard for Frank at that point. And I still thought there was a good chance that he would be able to do it. Remember, they went to Colorado that last week of the year, and they won that game. And there was, all the talk about how Steve Peterson didn't meet him out of the locker room. And there was a whole lot of feeling that he had saved his job, even with that, with the win in Colorado. And obviously that wasn't the case.
What was your reaction, your gut reaction, when you heard that he was being fired?
Yeah, I was disappointed. We did an emergency show. We were on the air late into the night. Barney Cotton came on, and all these guys came on with us, and they were all, as you might imagine, very disappointed. And the fan base, at the time, I felt like it was split. I became very outspoken. I said at the time I thought he should have kept his job. I thought he had earned another opportunity to show what he could do with the program. That was the first real bold stance that you took against the prevailing feeling of what the university was doing. We had deposed coaches on. That was the first night that you really felt like, okay, this thing's going to grow, our show and our station. This is going to grow into something bigger than what it had been for the first couple of years. The best thing that happened to that radio show and to that station was Nebraska football falling on hard times, because it had so many people passionately interested in what was going on with the program again, from one side or the other. And we were the ones that were on the air talking about it every single day. And we were the ones on the air talking about it outside of the official station of the Huskers. That was the big thing too. We could draw a direct contrast with what was being said on the mouthpiece stuff.
The counterculture, we'll call it, notion of the show. The idea of tribalism has always been there. It seems more pronounced today than it did then. But to give folks an idea, it was not usual to counter what the official university line was. It just wasn't. That was the nature of how everyone was in lockstep with the program. Did you feel like initially, late 2003, right before the firing, maybe right after the firing, you were swimming upstream, or that there was already a counterculture movement, what we had been traditionally thought of as, being everyone in the same boat?
I don't know that you felt it initially. Our show evolved, the station evolved, the mood evolved. I'm very arrogant, but I'm not arrogant enough to think somehow we made that change happen. But we were the sports talk show that was being different by criticizing, actually saying, this athletic director made a bad decision. And then he compounded it with that ridiculous coaching search. I mean, it was a joke. And everybody who wasn't affiliated at the time with the university knew that. And that was really the first time where you could see, does this guy really have any idea what he's doing? Does he really know how to approach this? Does he really have a plan in place? I can remember this as clear as day. And I'm not going to say the name of the person because that person is still around. There was a university employee in the midst of 2004. There's somebody higher up said, you got to be really careful here, because Steve Peterson used to think a lot of you, but you got to be really careful how you tread here. And I remember walking away from that conversation. And I remember thinking at the time, are we really having that kind of an impact on this? That the athletic director is sending out his minions to say to me, hey, watch your back. That was the first realization that I had, that we were doing something different. It happened elsewhere. I mean, it's not like New York hadn't experienced this for decades. But to have it happen in good old Nebraska with dear old Nebraska U, that was different. But that was the first time that I really had the notion that, holy crap, this station is making headway here. We're actually doing something here that's rattling the cage.
Were you intimidated by that? Was there a part of you where you were like, oh, I got to back this off?
No, it angered me. I remember being annoyed by it. And I remember thinking, I'm not employed by you. I give full credit, because I had these conversations. You know him, but a lot of people don't know the name Jim Carmichael, who was the longtime producer of a lot of NET sports. And he and Joe Turco, who was in charge of the division at the time and was for many years after, both had my back in a lot of difficult conversations where you had athletic department employees meeting with NET people saying, we don't want him involved in this. We don't want him involved in this. I have notes from the meetings that Jim, God rest his soul, gave me after the meetings, where they came in and basically tried to get me off of NET and try to push me away because I was being critical on a radio show of the university. There were moments where I was like, oh my gosh, what have I done? What's happening here? But I became kind of emboldened by the fact that my main job was to do a sports talk show. One of the other things I learned from Bob was you kind of have to live your life on the air. So you have to be genuine. You have to be authentic. And I always tried to be that. I think I always was. I mean, we were goofy, but I I'm goofy. And I had to be authentic with how I felt. I couldn't go out there and go, oh, this is great. This is wonderful. What's one losing season? There were just certain things that you had to do. Everybody's going to be mad at you one way or the other. So you may as well go with what you believe. And that's what I did. And it was that moment where, John, you just kind of knew that, all right, this is different and let's see where it goes.
Without Jim, without Joe, do you think things would have been different, that you would have basically had to back off at that point?
I think I would have had to give up Big Red Wrap-Up and probably stopped doing play-by-play for NET, which would have perhaps meant a different path in my career than where I am now. And if I had not had that kind of backing of really good people who knew me and knew I wasn't doing anything wrong, it would have been very different. I've been blessed. You and I both have. We've had a lot of good people in our corners over the years. And maybe the biggest name on that list is Neil Nelkin, who always shielded us from all of the junk from the brass or the fans or whoever, because that was his job. He's one of the best bosses I will have ever had. Regardless of where I work and what I do for the rest of my career, it's going to be hard to come up with one better than Neil Nelkin.
Was there ever a moment where Neil said, guys, you might want to dial it down a bit?
No. Here's the thing that I've always found funny. There are a lot of people who believe that we as broadcasters are told to say things. In my decade plus at the Zone, not one person ever came in and said, hey, I think you guys should do X, Y, or Z. Now, there were things that we'd said that then we had to answer for, like any other job. We had meetings about why would Michael say at one point, I'm thinking about the penis. I mean, there were things like that we had to answer for. None of them got us fired, which was good.
Obviously.
You cannot do this without having the support of people around you and above you, because there's just too much flack. Neil was always the guy who stood in the way of those phone calls and stood in the way of those complaints, and quite honestly, stood in the way of a boss or two. Told them these guys have to have the free reign to do it. And the good thing was 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, as then Michael and I are growing the show, it started to show in the ratings. Once you had the ratings to back it up, there really wasn't a whole lot that the bosses were going to do. Why would you kill this thing that's doing the job these people were asked to do?
Was there a time that you can recall where you thought, hey, what we're doing is working here. This is going to be good for us in terms of not only the show, but the radio station?
2004, at the end of the season, Scott Frost called in after Turner Gill was let go. When Turner left, Scott called in and went on this diatribe about this. It was amazing radio. And I remember thinking at the time, oh, that's going to be a big deal. That's going to get play. And it did. It was a pivotal moment for the show because it showed we were enough of a player at that point that people thought of us when that happened. We'd started to gain traction with former players. We'd started to gain traction with people who were close to the program. And that was really where you kind of felt that things were happening at that point. Like, okay, we're not just some goofy little low-powered radio station. All of a sudden, we've got some sort of a following, and we had a voice, and we were using our voice in a way that was different than other people had used it before. That was really the start of things again for 1620 The Zone. Our show started September 18th of 2000. I would say the firing of Frank Solich took it to a different level. Then the 2004 season took it to another level. I was sitting in that press conference when Bill Callahan said, it's just one game, one season. Then that was a big deal. And it was just another moment where this station continued to climb and grow. And it took bad things for the Nebraska fan base for that to happen. But it also took that to get people upset. It shows the passion of the fan base because people were livid and people wanted a place to voice their frustrations. And the only other option was the university's sports talk show. And they weren't going to get in there to voice those frustrations. It was unique to have goofy bits that made fun of the program. It was unique to have controversial topics. It was unique to have controversial guests who would rip the program and not be afraid to do so. It was a unique situation to be able to allow callers to rip the program in a public setting. That just didn't happen. Now, there wasn't a lot to rip before the show. I mean, before we started, it was a pretty steady stream of success. You weren't ripping a lot of things in 1997. There was a need for that outlet at that time, and we were fortunate enough to be the ones who filled that void.
Did you and Michael ever butt heads when it came to the direction you were going, or were you guys pretty much in lockstep the whole time?
We were close in lockstep. I mean, we obviously butted heads on a lot of different stuff. We come from very different backgrounds and very different political worlds and everything else. It was a pretty easy move for us to make. We both believed in, I'm just going to say what I think and what I see. I'll defend it, but if somebody else has a different opinion, we'll welcome that too. We never sat down before the show and said, all right, let's rip this today. I felt like we had a pretty good pulse on what fans were feeling. The 2007 year, the show took such a dramatic jump because of just the absolute devastation that was going on down in Lincoln. Every show we opened up with dramatic opens and sad moments. The bowl game that never was happened that year. It was Michael's idea. He thought we should do this simulated bowl game. So I simulated a bowl game on my PS2 in the college football game. All I did was record the first simulation I had. It was this dramatic Nebraska win over Notre Dame. So they sold a remote. It was in December. I remember telling Michelle, my wife, as I'm leaving, I'm like, well, we'll see how this goes. Michael was convinced it would work. I thought it was like, all right, we'll do it because it's December. What do I care? So we go down there. An hour before we go on the air, the place is packed. Little Red shows up. I mean, it was just this ridiculous, extravagant.
Wait, they sent Little Red?
Somebody got Little Red to show up. I don't know how. I have no idea how that happened. They ran out of beer. I mean, it was just the craziest day maybe ever. And my job was to try to figure out how to marry this as an in-person event with, because we're still doing a radio show. Luckily, we had a fake play-by-play guy who could come in and do some play-by-play of what was going on in the fake bowl game for the radio listeners so they could feel like they were involved. It was a ton of work. And people are cheering like it's a real thing. A 2007 PS2 simulation. Those were some very unique days.
And it certainly changed the way people listened to sports talk radio in this area. And certainly the zone wouldn't have become what it was without that time period. Kevin, thanks.
Thank you, John Bishop. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, you don't have to lie to me now. That'll do it. To hear more stories and memories of the last 25 years, go to 1620thezone.com/25 years.